It's nice to see you all here. Welcome once again. For those of you who were with us last time, we started this conversation sort of about what is this idea of what or who a prophet is in the Jewish tradition, and we'll do a little bit of both reminder and, if you weren't with us last time, just kind of refresher on what we talked about for just a minute. Today, we're going to be looking more at what this relationship between God and the prophet is, how one becomes a prophet in terms of the literary background of what our texts tell us about kind of the nature of, distinguishing a prophet from just everyone else, because you would maybe you would, or maybe you wouldn't be surprised to know that you're not just like born a prophet and your first words out of the womb are kind of magical prophecies. That's not exactly how it happens. So we're going to take a look at that whole process, and then sort of, again, the thrust of this whole series is to take the Jewish texts from their context and bring them into the modern world. So for me, it's fascinating to be able to look at what the texts say and to dig into that and really like analyze that in detail. But the whole point of this course is to see what these texts and sources can say to us today. Like, why is it relevant to continue studying the ancient prophets in now 2021, I'm happy to say. So that being said, I'm going to share a PowerPoint with everyone, and I can see all of you who are on video. I can see you great. There's no lag time right now. We've done a bunch of tests this week to make sure that the technology and internet were working well. So I want to encourage people, if you have questions or if something I say doesn't make sense or I use a word that I don't properly define, please feel free to, there's a little icon that you can like raise a hand or, write something in the chat and let us know you have questions. I really would encourage you to ask as many questions as you have as we're going on. We're going to try and monitor the chat, and also, people, waving at me to indicate that they're confused. And I would much rather stop and dig into a conversation than kind of gloss over a point and have people not following with me. So hopefully everyone will feel comfortable interrupting me and asking for clarification or some questions as we go along. So let me get this up and running. Okay. There. So we are on session 2. And today I've kind of titled this session the Prophetics, because certainly in the Jewish tradition, but also in a number of other traditions, there's this literary scene where a prophet gets called. And I will say right now in advance, not every single prophet in the Jewish tradition is exactly the same. They don't all have these exact same dramatic scenes, especially in the later prophets. Some of the prophets, especially there are a few prophets whose books of prophecy are only like 2 or 4 chapters long, and so they don't include sometimes these scenes of how they started becoming a prophet. Sometimes it's just recording their words, and that's all we get. But for the most part, there is this exploration of who this person is, how they came to be issuing prophecy, and there's a lot of commonalities, and I think we can learn something important from these scenes as well. So just to refresh, this is where we left off last time, with this quote from an article by Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks, who was formerly the chief rabbi of Great Britain for many years. And the sense of what he was conveying is that the Jewish prophets are not the same as classic literary oracles, meaning their primary function is not to predict the future, is not to issue a prophecy of something yet to come. Their primary function is to communicate a message to a certain person or group of people. Whether that's a single individual, there's a lot of scenes of prophets talking to a king, whether it's a Jewish king or some other king. And there's also a lot of times in the Jewish Bible where a prophet kind of gives a massive prophecy to a whole group of people, a whole nation, a whole city, things like that. And so if we take that as our framework, that the primary job of a prophet is to not just receive messages from God, but also to convey those messages and that the point of conveying the messages is to get some sort of reaction, to help people change their ways, or to, push them into a future that is better than the present, something that God wants people to actually do something with those words. Then the question becomes, why does God need the prophet? Why does God not just deliver a message to everyone? And we're going to dig into that question a lot today, because there is a difference between in the Tanakh, in the Jewish Bible, between scenes where God talks to a person or a group of people, which does happen, and when God talks to the prophets. Because not everyone who has a conversation with God in the Torah or in the Jewish Bible is technically considered a prophet. We're going to look at the difference today. So again, we looked at this list last time. These are, according to the rabbis of the Talmud, one of the main Jewish legal sources, these are the 55 kind of sanctioned recorded prophets from Tanakh. Most of them are names that are familiar, things like Abraham or Jacob or Esther or Sarah. Some of them may be less familiar to you. And something you'll notice, though, is that not every character you've ever heard of in the Bible is on this list. And there's a couple fairly large glaring examples. This list goes mostly chronologically. It's not exactly chronological in terms of when they appear in the Bible. But there were characters in the Bible before Abraham. Not, if you haven't read the book of Genesis, I don't mean to spoil anything, but there were other characters who came in the Bible for many chapters before Abraham. And there's two really notable examples that we're going to look at in just a second. But for purposes of our discussion, when we're looking at the prophetic call, which is God instructing a prophet, not just in what to say, but also kind of giving them the job. Like, hey, you down there, you're going to be a prophet. There's a whole scene that goes into that. Abraham is really the first one who gets that call. So we're going to take a look at Abraham a lot today. But first, I wanted to kind of investigate why it is that there's this distinction between people who may have a conversation with God or who may even receive instructions from God and a prophet, that there's something different about that relationship. So in order to do that, we need to look at what the process of becoming a prophet is. So this is the first scene where God is actually speaking to a person. The first couple chapters of Genesis have a lot of God talking, but it's unclear to whom God is talking. The whole first chapter of Genesis, God keeps saying things like, let there be light and let there be dry earth. But there's no one else to hear those messages. And so the text even specifically says sometimes God speaks to God's own self, which is very confusing. And I don't know what it sounds like when God talks to God's self, if it's like when I'm at home and I drop something on the floor and I say, oh, Scott, that was dumb. Like, I don't know if that's what it sounds like. But this is the first scene in the second chapter of Genesis where God is directly speaking to a person. And luckily, there's only one person at this point. So it's very clear who God is talking to. Talking to the person, Ha'adam, the only person that exists. And here's what God says to the person. God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till and tend it. God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you must not eat of it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die. So that's the first, quotable verbal conversation that God has with a person. And it's really notable the way that the original text, the Hebrew text, parses that out. It says, Vaitzav Adonai Elohim al ha'adam. Tzav, the Hebrew verb, is to command. It's the same word that gives us mitzvah, which means a commandment. And so that's very noteworthy. The first thing God says to the first person is as a command. It's saying, I'm going to give you instructions. You should do them. But notably, you'll note on the list of that the rabbis gave us in the previous page, Adam is not on this list. The first person is not on this list of prophets. So why is this receiving a direct conversation with God? Why is that not prophecy? Because here God is telling Adam to do something, and Adam goes and does it. He gets a message, he gets a command, and then Adam goes to do it. And in some traditions, that would be exactly what a prophet does. A prophet's someone who receives, divine messages and then enacts them. But the Jewish tradition has something slightly different in mind. So, and I also want to be clear, in terms of the rabbi's point of view, kind of universally, there's not really any disagreement amongst the rabbis. Adam was not a prophet. There's no sources I could find that says the first person, Adam Harishon, was a prophet, even though he directly talked to God. So that's something to keep in the back of our minds as well. We also have this wonderful guy named Noah. And Noah also had a few very lengthy conversations with God, got direct messages from God to do certain things in the world. And here's one of the first ones. God said to Noah, I've decided to put an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with lawlessness because of them. By the way, here, when it says all flesh, it means all people. It's kind of a semantic euphemism. I'm about to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood, make it an ark with compartments and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And here's how you shall make it. And it goes into excruciating detail in the next 7 verses about exactly how to make it, the exact measurements and materials. I did not want to include that because it takes up a lot of space. But after it gives this whole list of exactly how to make this ark, it says, and Noah did so, just as God commanded him, so he did. And again, Noah is not here considered to be a prophet. He gets a message from God. He does exactly what God commands him to do, but is not considered a prophet here. Tony just shared, I think that's a great insight. Perhaps a prophet, perhaps they are considered a prophet who is not given an eternal message, because last time we talked about there's this source from the Talmud that there were actually hundreds of thousands of prophets, but the only ones who are the recorded prophets are the ones who had an eternal message. That may be true. That may be part of it, because Noah's message is as to how to build an ark so as to save the world from a flood is hopefully not one we'll ever need in the future. Hopefully there will not be a flood that destroys the earth and we will each need to make our own ark. So it's not exactly an eternal message for the ages. So that's one possibility. I actually want to argue something slightly different than that, although along the same lines, that again, a prophet's job is not only to carry out God's commands, but actually to impart messages that change the way people behave, that cause some kind of change in the way either a single person or a group of people behave. So I want to take a look at what's kind of the sort of arc of becoming a prophet. And no one character in the Jewish Bible plays that out better than the character of Abraham, or as he is first known, Avram. Avram gets called similarly to Adam and Noah. He gets a message from God and he does it. But then we'll see that the character of who Avram was as he becomes Abraham, his name gets changed, changes in really important ways. And the relationship between Abraham and God is very different in both its character and in the actual function that Abraham plays as opposed to Adam and Noah. So I want to take a look at how that starts as well. The first thing that God says to Avram in chapter 12 of Genesis may be familiar to many of you. He says, Lech lecha me'artzecha, go forth from your native land and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and curse him that curses you, and all the families of the earth shall bless themselves by you. So Avram went forth as God commanded him, and Lot, his nephew, went with him. Avram was 75 years old when he left Haran. Haran is the place where he was living. Again, there's a whole lot we could comment about this section of Torah. It's a Torah portion called Lech Lecha. And much has been said about, this is amazing. He's 75 years old, and God, who has never spoken to him before, says, leave the place you've lived your whole life. And he says, I'm on it. And he goes. And so that scene should be very familiar to you from what we just talked about with Adam and Noah. God says to Adam, take care of the land and everything that lives, and he goes and does it in the Garden of Eden. And God says to Noah, build an ark, and Noah goes to build an ark. It's God commanding and the person responding by doing, but not, and I think this is important, by speaking. In these first scenes, Adam and Noah and Avram here don't say anything. They receive the message and they do. And that is a very big distinction between a person receiving a message and a prophet. Prophets speak, which may be oversimplifying, but that's the primary role of the prophet, is not to be a listener, but to be a speaker. And I want to argue that while the main function of a prophet is to speak to the people, whichever group of people they're assigned to talk to, actually they're speaking to God, having a conversation, which is a back and forth, a dialogue with God, is an important part of that, because it shows God that they're ready for that role. The ability to speak back to God, not to be confused with talking back to God, which is, what our children do, but speaking, responding to God, either with questions or comments or just even verbal acknowledgement of receiving the message, is actually going to be a big signpost that an individual is actively taking on this mantle of the prophet. So again, we return to Avram. This is his first conversation with God. He gets an assignment, he gets a command, he does it. A little while later, the word of God comes to Avram in a vision. God says, fear not, Avram, I am a shield to you, your word shall be great. And Avram said, O Lord, what can you give me, seeing that I will die childless, and I am the only one? And the only one in my household is Domestic Eliezer. Eliezer is the name of his sort of chief servant, helper person. Avram said further, since you have granted me no offspring, my steward will be my heir. Remember, just a couple of chapters ago, we just read, God says, your reward for following my command and going out into this land you don't know is to be, your offspring will be numerous of the stars. But he has no offspring. He has zero offspring. So he's arguing back with God. God, you said just a little bit ago, if I went on this journey, that my offspring would be numerous. I'm 75 years old. I have no offspring. How's that supposed to work? It's a legitimate question. But the fact that he asked the question is sort of the first inkling that Avram is on this path towards being kind of qualified or accepting this role as a prophet. Tony asks, do we speak to Hashem every day in our tefillah? Great question. Yes, but this is a little bit more of a literal conversation than the speaking to God that we do in tefillah. Speaking of God that we do in tefillah is more one-sided in that we're saying the words, and part of the spiritual practice of saying prayers is to have the either faith or the belief or the feeling that God is listening and in some way responding. But it's not a two-way conversation for most of us. At least I'll speak for myself. When I daven, Shafrin in the morning, I don't have a literal sense that God is actively speaking or responding to my prayers, questions, thoughts. I may have the, feeling in my life that God is speaking to me in different ways, but it's not the same sort of conversation that we're talking about here. Susan says, does Hashem speak out loud to the prophets, or does God speak inside their minds? Great question. I don't know. It's never fully clarified. But the assumption that the rabbis are working under is that the prophets actually hear God. They hear something clearly. They hear words that they don't have to interpret. They're actually getting a message. That's kind of the sense that the rabbis have throughout our tradition. So again, I never claim to be a prophet. So all of that I'm speaking of is taking literary sources and kind of parsing them out. I wish I knew the answer to that question. That would be fascinating to know how exactly the sensation of prophecy felt for the prophets. And some of the prophets do go into a little bit of detail when they're recording like some of the more grandiose visions that like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel have these very like fantastic visions of the heavenly hosts and all of these things. And they do talk a little bit about what that feels like. But all of the prophets, when they're recording these messages, use the language of language. They say, I heard these words from this angel or from God, or these are the actual words I heard, which gives you the sense that they heard them. And sometimes they, by the way, sometimes these visions do say, God came to me in a dream. There are some of those, but there are some where they're fully awake and going about their business, and it just says, God said to, Jeremiah, whatever God said. These are great questions. I really love that people are kind of curious and digging into the nature of this prophecy. So again, Avram raises the question, you promised me this, God. How can you possibly deliver? It seems impossible. And so the word of God comes to him in reply. That one, meaning your servant Eliezer, should not be your heir, but one of your very own issue, meaning a natural born child of yours, or one of your actual biological children, will be your heir. God took him, Abram, outside and said, look toward the heaven and count the stars if you are able to count them. And God added, so shall your offspring be. And because he, meaning Avram, put his trust in God, God accorded that trust to his merit. So here is, I don't want to call it an argument because an argument makes it sound angry, but Avram is saying, look, I did what you asked, God. I don't know how you're going to be able to fulfill this promise that I'm going to have these numerous offspring and become a great nation when I don't have any offspring and I'm already old, as is my wife. And God reassures him, no, this is something that's going to happen. I've said it once, I'll say it many, many other times in the story of Abraham. This promise gets renewed, and also to Abraham's children, Isaac and Jacob, the same words get used over and over again. And it seems that through this conversation, Avram stops bringing it up. It says, because he put his trust in God. Like, so this example, or this conversation rather, is one that reassures Avram of something that he needed to know. And God makes an active effort to reassure and to bolster the faith of Avram as he is in this process of becoming a prophet. Because I would argue that at this point, Avram is not necessarily taken on the role of prophet. He hasn't been speaking to anybody else. He's just been talking to God. He gets these visions, he gets these commands, and he does them in the world. This is really the first inkling where he's sort of speaking reciprocably to God and giving some feedback to God as well, which is not a small thing. In many traditions, giving feedback to the deity is not a thing that is done, especially in the ancient world. The deity says something and you do it, or sometimes a lightning bolt hits you. But this is a very different relationship. And I think that's really important as well to understand how that works. So Avram continues, goes through many more episodes. This is one of the most famous conversations between Avram, who is now Abraham, and God. God says the outrage, the sinfulness, the bad behavior, however you want to characterize it, of these two cities, Sodom and Amorah, Sodom and Gomorrah, is so great and their sin is so grave. I will go down to see whether they have acted altogether according to the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will take note. And the men, so it's unclear who these men are. Most of the rabbinic authorities say men here means angels. Went on from there to Sodom, while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. And Abraham came forward and said, will you sweep away the innocent along with the guilty? What if there should be 50 innocent in the city? Will you then wipe out the place and not forgive for the sake of those innocent 50 who are in it? Far be it for you to do such a thing. The Hebrew here is amazing. It says, Halil lacha, like cursed, prohibited shall it be for you, God, to do such a thing, to bring death upon the innocent as well as the guilty, so that the innocent and guilty fare alike. Far be it from you. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. It's a great, like, powerful phrase in the Hebrew. Shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? And this is one of the most famous arguments in all of Torah, because what's happening here is God says to God's self, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. That's my plan. Before I do that, I'm going to tell this human being what my plan is, to see what he says. God's language is that of, well, I'd feel bad not at least telling Abraham that I'm going to be destroying these cities. It's like, why would God feel bad? God doesn't have to feel bad. God is God. And yet here, God takes the time before going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, not only to tell Abraham that it's going to happen, but to explain why. That God says, there have been horrible things going on in the city. There have been murders and assaults and terrible, terrible sinful behaviors. And because of that, these cities are going to be destroyed. And Abraham hears that. And instead of just saying, oh, you're commanding that these things happen, you gave me other commands, which I immediately fulfilled, Abraham says, that doesn't sound right to me. Everything I know about God is that God is a just God, that God's whole mission is to make the world a more just place in accordance with God's laws and God's visions of fairness and equality. This doesn't sound fair. Let me question that. And there's a long series famously that Abraham first says, well, if there's 50 innocent people, you won't destroy the city. And God says, sure. If I find 50 innocent people, fine. And then Abraham says, well, what about 40? What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? Talks God all the way down to, if there's 10 innocent people, the city will be spared. Now, the catch is the cities are not spared, because as it turns out, they can't even find 10 innocent people within the city to spare the city. And so the rabbis ask the question, well, doesn't God know that? Doesn't God know who's innocent and guilty when God looks down and sentences these cities to be wiped out? And most of the rabbis say, yeah, God knows that, but that's not the point of this conversation. The point of the conversation is, what is Abraham going to say when I tell him I'm going to wipe 2 human cities off the face of the map? Is Abraham going to say, thank you, God, for including me in this loop of conversation. Go right ahead. I will stand back. Is Abraham going to say, I quit. Too much for me. I can't handle that. And it turns out he doesn't do either. He says, God, I understand what you just said. If indeed every single person in these cities is wicked to the core and beyond salvation, okay, that would make sense to me, or at least I can accept that. But instead he says, it can't be. I can't accept that every person is wicked. Surely there must be some good people here. So I hate to call it a test because that makes it sound kind of calculating on God's part, but it's really a way for God to understand who Abraham is better, and also to help Abraham feel out what's the role of a prophet in this situation. Because the thing we will find over and over again is that, as I've said before, the prophet is a communicator communicating in 2 directions. On the one hand, he's receiving messages from God that he then delivers to people. On the other hand, he's sort of the people's representative when talking with God. The prophet often, not every prophet, but often goes to God saying, look at what the people need. They're asking for X, Y, and Z. They need these things. You, God, have the power to do that. I, as a person, don't. So let me advocate on behalf of the people to you. And this is really the first time we see that. We see it again over and over again with the prophet Moses, who, the Jewish people are not exactly on their best behavior during their 40 years of wandering in the desert later on. And they frequently, I don't want to say bellyache, but that's the best word I could think of. They're frequently complaining to Moses about, this is not fair, and we need this, and we want more meat, and where's the water? And sometimes Moses says, these people are driving me nuts. And sometimes Moses says, look, God, the people are suffering. They can't do it by themselves. They need some help. I'm advocating on their behalf to you. Please help them. And this is really the conversation that sets up that part of the prophetic job. It's very fascinating. Susan asked the question, doesn't Cain speak back to Hashem after he killed Abel? Great question. So there's I almost included, but then because of, I felt like I had too many texts and we would go too far over time, and I don't like going over people's time. But yes, there's very famous conversation between God and Cain after Cain kills his brother Abel. If you've never read the story, it's a fascinating look into human nature. I highly recommend. It's very short, towards the beginning of the book of Genesis. But yeah, except when Cain speaks back to God, he's not questioning God, he's dodging his own guilt. So when God speaks to Cain, he says, "Where's your brother?" And the rabbinic commentary is, well, God knows. God knows that Abel is dead. He's not asking for information. He's asking to see, is Cain going to admit what he did wrong or not? And Cain fails the test. He doesn't admit. He's, am I my brother's keeper? Very famous line. How should I know where Abel is? He could be anywhere. Of course, Cain knows where he is. He buried him in the ground after killing him. And so, again, that sort of speaking back to God is less a conversation with God. It's more of Cain kind of out loud trying to wrestle with his own guilt and failing really to wrestle with his own guilt, to come to terms with what he actually did and actually seek to do tshuva, to do some kind of recompense or reflection on his own misdeeds. But Susan, that's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Hold on. There we go. So we've had all these episodes with Abraham, who becomes Abraham, in hearing God's message, in responding verbally to God's message. And finally, after many, many, many different episodes, we're already 7 chapters into Abraham's story. It says the following. After some time, after all of these things, God put Abraham to the test. God said to him, Abraham, and he answered, "Here I am." Vayomer alav Abraham, vayomer hineni. This word hineni is a very, very important word in the Jewish Bible. There are other ways to say, I am here, like physically, I am in this place. You would say, "Ani po," like I'm here. That's how if you were in Israel and a teacher was taking roll call and they said, "Scott," and you want to say, "I am here," you'd say, "Ani po." But when there's a specific call out to a person, they say hineni. And it means more than like, I am, sitting here at this table. It's a sort of admission of spiritual position. I am here, and the implication is also I am ready. I'm ready to do whatever is going to be asked of me. I'm ready to take on a new role. I'm ready for this next conversation we're going to be having, which is usually a tough conversation from the point of view of the prophet. It's usually not God saying, "Well, glad you're here. We can go get ice cream now." It's saying, "I'm glad you're ready. I have a tough job for you." And that's something that often, it's easy to miss, although the rabbis talk about it a lot. The job of the prophet is a terrible job. It's a horrible job. It's a difficult job because your job is to speak inconvenient truths to people, especially people who are in power. Your job is to hold up a mirror to humanity and show them where their faults are. And nobody likes that. Nobody appreciates being told how much they're wrong or how they're missing the mark. It's a very difficult thing to be called out. Even if you know you're wrong, even if you know you haven't been doing what you're supposed to be doing, when someone else reminds you how you haven't been doing what you're supposed to be doing, it's very difficult. And it's a very lonely existence for the prophet to have to go into these situations and call people out. Nobody wants to embrace that. I shouldn't say nobody. Very rarely do people want to embrace that. And so for the prophet to get to the point to say, okay, I'm ready to accept that job is often a big ask. You can see it took 7 chapters to really get to that point where Abraham says hineni. And you see many other prophets. We talked before about the prophet Jonah. Jonah gets called by God and he immediately runs out of the country, tries to flee to a different nation. And a lot of the commentators say it's not just that he was afraid that something would happen. He understood fully how difficult it is to be a prophet and felt, I'm not up to it. And even Moses, who the rabbis generally consider to be sort of like the greatest prophet and teacher in the Jewish tradition, the scene where he gets called to prophecy is verse after verse of him trying to argue with God, saying, not me. There's got to be somebody better. I'm not good enough. I can't handle the job. No one's going to listen to me. Pharaoh will kill me. On and on and on, arguing to not be the one who has this responsibility. And it's not because he was scared or self-deprecating. It's because he fully understood the weight of the responsibility that was being asked of him. There's a great quote that I think is attributed to Mark Twain, that the problem with elected leaders is that the only people who want the job aren't qualified for it. And the idea is, like, if you really understood what it was like to be, in charge, to be leading people, to be speaking truth to power, no sane person would want that responsibility, because it's so much. It's almost too much for a single person. And it's only really because they're needed that the prophets in the Jewish Bible eventually step up and fill those roles. So this literary kind of setup is like a signpost saying this person's a prophet. They're about to embark on some very important job. And we see it again with Moses. Moses also gets called to prophecy in the very famous scene in chapter 3 of Exodus, where the burning bush. Moses is tending his sheep. He is a Jewish person who's been raised in the Egyptian palaces. He goes and out to do his daily routine of feeding the sheep, and he sees a bush that is on fire but not consumed. Really amazing turn of phrase. And so Moses says, I must turn aside and look at this marvelous sight. Why doesn't the bush burn up? And when God saw that he had turned aside to look, God called to him out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And Moses answered, Hineni, here I am. This is also something, by the way, that appears a lot when God calls out to someone with something really important. You hear their name twice to say, like, pay attention, you, I'm talking to you, listen. And that response to say Hineni is not supposed to be like a knee jerk again of like, oh, I heard something. What? I'm here. What do you want? Not like the phone ringing and answering it. More like picking up the phone call and someone asking you, I need you to pick me up from the hospital, and you say, I'm there. You accepting the responsibility of the ask that someone is asking you. And the ask here of the prophet is coming from God. And the response of Hineni is a way to say, okay, I'm starting in on this new chapter of my life, which is being a prophet. I wanted to put this in because I think it's actually one of my favorite calls to prophecy in the prophets. Samuel is a very interesting character. He was sort of born into this special role. He was raised in by the priests of the temple to kind of serve in the temple. And he's still a child when he first hears God calling from him. And when God calls out to Samuel, he says, Hineni, as all these other prophets are. But instead of, listening to the words of God, he runs downstairs to this man, Eli, who is one of the people who raised him, the high priest who helped raise him. And he says, what do you want? Why are you calling me in the middle of the night? And he does this 3 different times. He runs up and down the stairs every time he hears his name saying, you keep calling. Why are you calling? And finally, Eli figures out like, oh, there's something bigger happening here, and says, okay, stop saying Hineni and running downstairs, you tiny, tiny child. Go back up. Instead, if you're called again by God, say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So Samuel runs back to his place. God comes, and it's very interesting. But God came and stood there, and God called as before, Samuel, Samuel, Shmuel, Shmuel, and Samuel answered, speak, for your servant is listening. There's a lot I could say about God stood there. Vayityasav is the Hebrew word, and it's a reflexive verb, and there's a lot of kind of content. What does it mean for God to stand somewhere? Most of the commentators say God made God's presence more known so that it was clear that it was God calling and not someone calling from downstairs. But again, here we have the same thing again. God calls out to the prophet, and the prophet makes known that they're ready to listen and to take on this role. And here in Samuel's case, it's even more clear. He doesn't just say hineni, he says it 3 times. And the last time, this 4th time, he makes it explicit what he means. He says, speak, for your servant is listening. And listening here means there's 2 different verbs in Hebrew. One means listening and one means hearing. So this verb shema, which is used here, means to really listen and also to understand. Lahakshiv means your ears are working. It means to physically hear something. But Shema in both the context of the Jewish Bible and the rabbi's context means to really be paying attention and to be learning something from your listening. There's one sec. It's Tony says there are many people who take on the role of speaking truth to power. Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Akiva, Black Lives Matter. Are we not hearing the voices of modern prophets? It's a great question. I would argue yes, that they're taking on exactly the role of the prophet, which is that they're delivering sacred messages about moral truth to the public, specifically to those in power, but also to everybody else, saying, this is right, this is wrong, let's all get on the right side of history, saying, oppressing people is wrong, and look at the oppression that's happening and take action. I think those are great examples, actually, of people using that exact same prophetic voice to get people to change their behavior, whether those people are the people who actually hold levers of power or the average citizen. It's a really great point. Thank you, Tony. I want to look at one more. This last one, again, is from the prophet Isaiah. His call to prophecy is interesting in that it comes in chapter 6 of the book of Isaiah. So if you didn't know, Isaiah is one of the longest books in all of Tanakh, just by the number of chapters. There's 56 chapters in the book of Isaiah. He has a lot to say. Many scholars think that it was actually once 2 separate books of Isaiah, which makes sense because it is very long. It is so long. But he gives 5 whole chapters worth of prophecy and messages before he talks about how he came to be a prophet. And it's this fantastic scene. It's a scene that actually plays out in a lot of Jewish liturgical prayers. Famously in verse 3, there's this vision of the angels looking at each other and declaring, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, God's presence fills the earth. In the Hebrew, kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzavaot, Melo kol haaretz kavodo. We say that several different times a day in our prayer services. And it comes from this vision of Isaiah, that this is what the angels do to glorify God. So when we say that during our liturgy, what we're doing is actually reenacting the role of angels in declaring, God, the creator of the universe, the Holy One of blessing. So Isaiah sees this amazing vision. And then if you look at verse 6, it says, one of the seraphs are a classification of angels. If you're interested in studying angelology, there's a lot of different strata of angels, different names for different types of angels who each have a unique function. Seraphim are one of the higher echelons of angels. So one of the seraphs flew over me with a live coal, which he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs. He touched it to my lips and declared, now that this has touched your lips, your guilt shall depart and your sin shall be purged away. Then, and only then, I heard the voice of my Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, Hineni shlacheni. Here I am, send me. Again, more explicitly, I think, than any other prophet before him, this use of Hineni is saying, I'm ready. I'm ready to do this work. I am ready to speak these truths, these moral truths to people. And in Isaiah's case, he was speaking to the king. He was speaking against very powerful foreign kings. He was speaking to the massive amount of Jewish people. And he was speaking in times where things were not easy, where there was all kinds of upheaval and conflict. And he was predicting at various times both the destruction of Jewish centers and Jewish life, and then subsequently the recreation of Jewish life after they had been exiled. So for him to kind of declare in this way, I'm accepting this role, is actually a really big thing. That he knew the role would be difficult, that it would be not easy. And so I just wanted to kind of re-emphasize this idea of calling out a prophet versus just God having a conversation with a person. And I think it hinges on this acceptance of the responsibility. So God has lots of conversations with Adam in the Garden of Eden. And one of the more famous is after Adam and Eve both eat from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they gain all kinds of knowledge. One of the big things they first notice is that they have been naked the whole time, and they get embarrassed by this. So they put on some clothes, and God calls out to Adam and says to him, "Where are you?" Again, not a question that God needs to ask, but God is looking for what Adam's response is. And Adam replies, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and because I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid." Whereas again, when we looked at Abraham, God is about to put Abraham to the test, and God says to him, "Abraham," and he answered, "Here I am." That right there is I think the most clear textual distinction between having a conversation with God and being a prophet, is that when God calls and you hide from God, you're not one who can kind of serve God's purpose, which is to be out front. A prophet is out front. They are the mouthpiece. They are speaking to people and to God. And so when you are hiding from that, when you are avoiding God, which is really avoiding the truth about the universe, it's impossible to be a prophet. It's impossible to be speaking truth to power. It's impossible to try and change things. You can't change things in the world while hiding. And so that's why it's so significant that the vast majority of the prophets from that list of 55 that we had, in some way or another, have a Hineni moment, have a moment where they acknowledge out loud, verbally, "I am ready for this. I am going to take on this role." So I was reading an article by Rabbi David Silverberg. It was written, I don't know, 10 or so years ago. And he kind of sums it up this way. When God first spoke to Abraham to issue this command, meaning the command to have this test, which is God tells him to kill his son Isaac. He doesn't actually kill his son Isaac. He gets stopped at the last minute. He responds, Abraham replied, "Hineni, here I am." Commenting on this word, Rav Avraham ben Harambam writes in his Torah commentary, it seems that underlying his, meaning Abraham's, response of Hineni is the fact that he was prepared at the time of calling, preparation which testifies to the understanding he had before the calling. Following the teachings of Rav Avraham's father, the Rambam, who's a very famous Torah commentator, Rabbi Moshe Maimonides, the Rambam, Rav Avraham works on the assumption that nobody can receive prophecy without prior rigorous intellectual preparation. Avraham's declaration of Hineni immediately upon hearing God call to him reflects his preparedness for this prophecy, the fact that his mind had already been ready to receive the prophetic message. And I'll go a step further. Not only was his mind ready to receive the message, he was ready to do something with that message. Rav Avraham proceeds to note the distinction between Avraham's response and that of Adam. When God spoke to him in the Garden of Eden, Gan Eden, after he partook of the forbidden tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Whereas Avraham responded, Hineni, Adam responded, "I was frightened, for I am naked, so I hid." Avraham lived in a state of preparedness, ready to receive and obey God's word. Adam, however, was caught off guard and was frightened upon hearing God's voice. And the argument I'm going to make is that the reason that Abraham was prepared was because he had 7 chapters worth of encounters with God, where God was shaping his ability to be receptive. The fact that God comes to him and says, I'm going to destroy these 2 cities, Sodom and Gomorrah, is not just a heads up for Abraham. Because God could have just destroyed the cities and Abraham would not have known anything was the miss. He would say, oh, some cities got destroyed. That's very tragic. But God specifically comes to him to say, look, if you're going to be a prophet, what you're going to need to understand is that I'm going to be telling you things, some of which are hard to hear, and you're going to have to do something with those messages to try and affect the world. And so Abraham's response of arguing with God, is this really the right thing? Is this not? Is a way for him to, in real time, try on the role of prophet, to try to understand what's my place in between humanity and God. What is my role in communicating God's message, but also in communicating people's needs to God? And that's why several chapters later, when we get to chapter 22, and God says, Abraham, and he responds, Hineni, Abraham was prepared. He knew that something was going to be asked of him to serve in a capacity for God. He didn't know exactly what that would be, obviously, but he knew that there was going to be something difficult asked of him. And he said, I'm ready to listen. I'm ready to hear. Dr. Erica Brown wrote this article in 2015 called The Hineni Moment. And I thought it was a really beautiful kind of look at how this relationship between God and the prophet, as we've been spelling out here, impacts us today. And kind of here's the commentary that she shares. We tend to focus on the response to the call rather than the request itself, which is true. A lot of the commentators are so caught up in the fact that the prophets just say Hineni, that they're gung-ho about it, that they respond correctly and say the right words. But that's not the only point. The point is that they were called, that they specifically were called. Continuing on. But the Bible invites us to invite. In other words, if you want to get someone to do something, you have to ask. If you don't ask, you don't get. It's also who you ask and how. When you recruit someone to a task, you want to use their name and make an argument for uniqueness. It is no coincidence that several call texts, God or an angel doubles the name. Abraham, Abraham, Moses, Moses, Samuel, Samuel, as if to say, it's you and only you that I want. And the call needs to be specific to a task so that when the magic word Hineni is said, it is said with full recognition of the momentousness and the consequences of what lies ahead. And a call has to be just that, a call. It's the singling out of someone for something special, a selection. It's the power of invitation. I think here that she really has a great picture of this relationship of the prophet that's being built up in our texts. And a lot of times we do focus on like what a prophet does, on like their words of moral clarity, on their connection with God, and all these things. But I think it's important also to understand this Hineni moment, this calling out from God to the prophet, as also a model for us to be able to talk to one another. That so often we ask things of each other. I mean, that's just the nature of being a social animal. Being a human being is being in community, and we ask things of each other all the time. Most of the time, they're innocuous, like, hey, can I borrow that pen? But when we're trying to do important things, big, momentous, world-changing things, we necessarily have to do them together. And whether we're talking about, formal leaders saying, hey, will you help me with this initiative? Or whether we're talking about, each other in everyday community saying, I'm struggling and I need help. Could you help me? The ask is important, and how we ask is critical. Just think about someone asking you for something. If someone calls you up and says, look, I'm calling all the people in our synagogue's directory, and I'm hoping that one or two of them will, come with me to work a shift at the food shelter. That's an ask. You're being honest, you're saying what you need, you're being very clear. But how much better of an ask is it if someone calls you up and say, look, I've been thinking of you. I know that this is a cause that you really care about, and I really wanted to include you in the planning of this program that we're doing to help veterans, or to clean up our environment, or to raise money for the synagogue, or whatever it is. That's a much better ask. Being able to say, like, I'm calling you specifically for a reason. Scott, I am calling you because I need your help. I don't just need help, I need you, and you have something special that is needed in this moment, that's critical in this moment. So I have a lot of background before even going to rabbinical school and on the process of becoming a rabbi, in community organizing. It's sort of what my lens is when I look at the world, is through an organizing lens. And this right here, kind of taken wholesale from our text, is community organizing 101. You don't just, like, anytime you have a conversation with somebody, there should be an ask. Even if the ask is, let's talk again, or I want to take you out to coffee. There should always be some kind of ask, because what you're asking them is not necessarily to help you with a project. Sometimes the ask is just building a relationship. And that the key to eventually having some bigger ask of help me plan this program, or help me raise money, or help me change the world, has to be based in relationship, because no one will listen to you if they don't know who you are. They won't. I'm sure all of you do. I get calls all the time from people who don't know me and who I don't know. And on the rare chance where I get fooled and I think that, a robocaller is actually a human being that I know calling me, and I pick up the phone and I get the message, hello, Mr. Scott Shafrin. Would you like to switch your credit card's rate to a new annual percent? I get frustrated, because that is not a call to me. That is an annoyance by a robot trying to get me to get some of my money. It's a very different call when I get a phone call from someone I know and trust asking me for something. And I think that's the biggest point I want us to take away from this too, is that the prophet's role is a role of trust. They're trusted by God to deliver a certain message, to carry out certain actions, whatever those may be in that person's lifetime. But they're also trusted by the people to say and do what's right. There are these great scenes, two in particular, that we may look at in a future session. I realize we're coming towards the end of our time. But both Moses and Samuel, when they're kind of reaching the end of their tenure and they know that their time being a prophet is sort of up, their leadership role is coming to a close, they have these great dramatic scenes where they gather everybody around and say, was I not a good leader? Did I take one thing that was not due to me? Did I lead one person astray through lies and deceit? And of course, the answer that remains unstated is no, they didn't. But what they're saying is that's the role of a prophetic leader. It's to be inherently trustworthy. It's to be someone who speaks the truth even when it's painful, even when it's hard to hear, because that advances people forward. That brings us as a community, as a society, as a world towards a place of more justice, towards a more sacred place. And as we look in the next couple of sessions, hopefully you'll all be able to join the next 2 Thursdays. We're going to look at what exactly some of those prophetic roles are, and how they shape not only their own time, but how they shape future people, how their words echo into our own time and hopefully into the future. But all of those only have an impact if you trust the words. And I'm sure all of us know this. When you hear something from a source that's inherently untrustworthy, even if the words sound reasonable, if the source is not trustworthy, you doubt the words. And so for the source to be inherently a trusted source, for the prophetic voice to be inherently trustworthy above all else, is critical. And we'll see that, especially when they're talking to kings and leaders who don't want to hear the message. When the prophet comes and says something they don't want to hear, they still listen, more often than not. Sometimes they don't. And that's kind of the mark of a really bad ruler. Is when a prophet comes to call you to task and you have a violently bad reaction to that prophet, you're probably on the wrong side of history. So in the last couple of minutes, we have a couple of good questions that I really want to make sure we get to. Does God prefer prophets to question God or not? Amazing question. Amazing question. That is kind of like the heart of understanding of the Jewish tradition. Most rabbis would say God prefers the prophets to question because the rabbis love to question. And questioning is so endemic to just all of Jewish understanding of text. The rabbis are the first to say, there are things in our Jewish texts, especially Torah texts, that seem confusing if you just read them at surface value. You have to investigate. You have to ask the questions. And they go so far as to say that the texts are in, like the language of the text are intentionally confusing just to get you to think about, do I understand this or don't I? Why is this word used here when an easier word could have easily been used? Why does this seem like it's out of order? And it's actually the text inviting you in. Because if you're not putting yourself into the reading of the text, then you're just memorizing. And so much of Jewish tradition is that questioning, is that arguing. In the time of the rabbis of the Talmud, the test, if you want to call it that, for becoming a rabbi was they gave you a certain legal scenario and you had to make 40 arguments for one side and 40 arguments for the other side. That's how you knew you were ready to be a rabbi, when you could argue with yourself and try to convince yourself that you were wrong. If that doesn't say anything about Jewish people, I don't know what does. And so I do think that the arguing with God is an important point, but, and this is kind of a big but, I think also the prophets could be relied upon to carry out God's messages. Very rarely do you have a prophet who just doesn't do what God says, who says, I refuse to do that thing. It's unreasonable. I'm not going to do it. Even Abraham, who questions God frequently, Moses questions God frequently, Jonah, who runs away to another country to avoid being called as a prophet, even they eventually say, you know what, God, you're asking me to do something sacred, and so I'm going to do it. Very rarely does it ever happen anywhere in Tanakh where a prophet says, nope, you're wrong. This is not going to happen. Not going to do it. Like, I'm struggling as I'm talking to think of an example. I can't think of a specific example where that happened. So again, the questioning, I think, is part of that relationship, that God trusts the prophet to understand what is true and right and moral. And also the prophet trusts God to be able to listen to their questions as not a sign of disobedience, but as an attempt to understand, as an attempt to build a relationship. The example that I've read from a number of rabbinic commentators is, imagine you never got into a fight with your significant other. Never. You never questioned anything they ever said to you. You never, ever fought. That would be weird. That would be odd to never have any disagreements. But part of the beauty of having a partner that you trust and are spending your life with is that you can have arguments and not question that you're unloved. You can fight with them in very, intense ways and not doubt that they still care about you. And so often, the relationship with God is portrayed as this marriage relationship, God and the people, God and the prophet. But I think here too, it really holds up, that those questions are so welcome, but also that they're part of a process of getting a human being who is imperfect and limited to understand at least in part the nature of God's interest in the universe, which it's a big thing to try and understand. I apologize. It's 1:05. I do not like taking people over time, and I appreciate all of you for hanging out with me for a few more minutes. And thank you so much for your questions and insights. I love hearing them. We're going to meet again next Thursday, also at noon, and the Thursday after. We're going to take a look at some specific prophets and how their words may or may not have an impact in their own time, and also how they may have an impact in our time. So that's going to be the focus of our next 2 sessions. And thank you once again to the Mirowitz Center for hosting this. It's been really great to get to talk with all of you, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.
Thank you, Rabbi
Thank you,
Shafrin. It
Thank
was
you, Rabbi
wonderful.
Yeshua.
Thank you, everybody, for coming back today. And we did have a much smoother technical day today. Yes. Thank you, and see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.